I'm Carol Angela Davis coming to you via Skype interviewing Dr. David Richardson. Dr. Richardson is an associate professor of epidemiology at the University of North Carolina. We should also tell you that he is an advisor to the president on radiation and worker health. So he comes to us highly qualified. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Richardson.
It's my pleasure.
We'll be right back with Dr. Richardson. You stay tuned. He's going to talk to us about the crisis in Japan. Stay with us.
Attention, all Medicare beneficiaries who need assistance getting around their home. Imagine one scooter or power chair that could improve your mobility and your life. One Medicare benefit that, with private insurance, may entitle you to pay little to nothing to own it. One company that can make it all happen.
Your power chair will be paid in full.
The Scooter Store.
Call the Scooter Store for free information today.
Call 1-800-461-9430 and we'll send you this lighted magnifier just for calling. Call the Scooter Store now.
Carol Angela Davis, I'm back with you via Skype. I am here with Dr. David Richardson. Dr. Richardson, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.
And as you know, Dr. Richardson is an epidemiologist. Let's get right into it. If you could tell us first, Dr. Richardson, what is an epidemiologist and why is your area of expertise so relevant in a crisis such as the nuclear crisis in Japan?
Well, first, an epidemiologist is somebody who studies where disease occurs and why it occurs, why some people are more likely to get sick than others. So you might have heard, or people might be familiar with epidemiologists who study the distribution and causes of HIV or tuberculosis. I focus on the distribution of cancers. So a lot of my work focuses on environmental causes of cancer or occupational causes of cancer. And in particular, I focus on radiation as a cause of cancer. So I've done a lot of work with communities around facilities that release radiation or workers at nuclear facilities. Here in the United States, for example, the Department of Energy. And then also in Japan, I've worked on studies of survivors of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
So you come to the table extremely well versed in the subject matter, and so if you could tell us kind of what is the current state, of the disaster in Japan today, April 4th, 3rd, 4th, 5th, as people, see this interview.
The state of the disaster is fairly serious. We're now into the third, going into fourth week, so almost a month since the tsunami, and the Fukushima plant is still in a really precarious situation. It's continuing to leak out radioactive material. So this would be, there are concerns about the operation of the plant, the fact that it's not operating anymore. But from an environmental perspective, a really serious concern is that it seems to be chronically hemorrhaging radioactive material. So it's probably both out of the spent fuel ponds where they store the fuel that's come out of the reactor, and then also now out of the reactors themselves. So the news has had a lot of information about loss of water, contaminated water flowing out of the facility and into the sea, as well as venting of radioactive gases up into the air. So measurements of radioiodine, not just in Japan, but crossing the ocean and actually surrounding the world now.
Now, let's talk a moment about the people who are, first of all, the Fukushima 50, the workers who are there working the plant every day, and then the people who have been evacuated from the plant. What is, when you talk about cancer, risk of cancer, you've got the cesium, the plutonium, the radiation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the workers at the plant are facing really hazardous conditions. I mean, there's no denying this at this point. You could start with the standard hazards that you might face, other workers might face in emergency response situations. So there have been a series of explosions at the plant. These are caused by hydrogen gas, which is rising up and was pooling and then was sparked, and so they were having detonations or explosions of gas. They're working in extremely hot surroundings, just physically hot, thermally hot. If you've ever been to visit a nuclear facility, a nuclear power station, it's a windowless structure. So this was one of the big concerns early on about getting light into it. It's actually a massive concrete structure with catwalks, and so they were going into a dark windowless facility. It was extremely hot. There was dangers of explosions. The floors were flooded because they were pumping in water for emergency cooling, and they were working in suits. So just from a first kind of the physical hazards they were facing, this in the sense of non-radiological hazards, it was very dangerous. Progressively, it's gotten more and more dangerous radiologically from the sense that I get. There are work areas now where spending 10 or 15 minutes would lead to exceptionally high radiation doses, 250 millisieverts, where a millisievert is a unit of radiation exposure.
And the people, as they spread out, the people who've been evacuated, what's their, what is it like for them in terms of, risk to cancer?
Well, it's interesting. There's been a problem of a lot of the environmental monitoring early on was not functioning around the area, and it's perhaps not surprising. There was a lot of destruction of infrastructure. Now there's been a series of different organizations going through mapping out areas that, as of today or as of last week, appeared relatively to be more exposed and less exposed. And there have been some towns that have been found that have radiation exposure levels which I think by most conventional standards you would say are not safe places to be, particularly for children to spend long periods of time in, or pregnant women. So
would that mean that those towns are not livable now? I mean, would you suggest that people or would it be your thought that people in towns that are like this should just move out? Or are these towns livable? And is there risk, but you can, live there?
Right. There are towns where people over a span of 10 days, let's say, are getting doses that would be the equivalent of a CT scan at least. Now, I don't think anybody would advocate that every week to 10 days a child get a CT scan. Those are procedures which there's already concern in the United States about the expected cancer risk to young children from delivering those doses. But that's a cost-benefit decision that's made, and I think an appropriate one, by a medical provider in situations where you want to make an emergency assessment on a child. But in terms of environmental contamination, those are not acceptable levels of dose. So for the short term, no, those won't be safe places for children to be.
I'm sorry.
They need to be moved out, and they need to do a more full assessment of the level of contamination, and then, if necessary, do remediation.
And when we talk about remediation, are we talking just radiation? Are we talking the cesium-137, the plutonium? Are we talking all of those?
So there are different sources of radiation. When they're measuring the radiation that's coming up off the ground, for example, it's because radioactive gases or particles have been deposited there. They've been transported by the wind, for example. And to do remediation, they would, at this point, they would probably need to remove the topsoil to take that away, and they'll take away the particles of cesium or plutonium, whatever has deposited there that's causing this radiation field that they're measuring. So they'll try and physically move that away. There's different strategies for doing that. I don't know what the Japanese will decide upon.
But certainly they would have to remove the topsoil, and I don't know how much topsoil you could possibly remove. A lot of topsoil out there. So now what about the U.S.? What are your thoughts? I mean, are we in any sort of danger from fish or fowl or winds or rain or anything like that? Ocean water, now that we know that today they're pumping lots of radioactive water into the ocean?
Yeah, well, we're a good distance from Japan, and so the expectation is that there's both a time delay, which is beneficial in the sense that things like radioiodine have a short half-life, and so they're decaying over time, over 8 days. Half is the half-life for radioiodine. So it takes a while for iodine to get here from Japan, but there are other isotopes that are longer-lived. We're also beneficial in being a distance because it means that the exposure is more diluted. So what my expectation is that it will be an almost imperceptible kind of additional risk that most people will face. So for an individual, we have lots of environmental causes of cancer, and this is contributing to the general environmental level of hazards, of exposure to things that are carcinogenic. We've slightly increased our exposure to things like iodine-131 and cesium, perhaps strontium. So there's going to be a small excess risk. It's not going to be anything that a person, I would expect, is going to be able to, that's going to be perceptible, because we're not going to be able to discriminate about who's getting more exposure and less. But on the other hand, I believe, in a lot of other people who do work in the areas of radiobiology and radiation epidemiology believe that additional exposure leads to additional cancers. So we have lots of causes of cancer out there, and by increasing our levels of exposure, we're going to have an increased risk that there will be some extra cancers caused by it. But we're not going to be able to say whose cancer it was or where.
Let me ask you a final question. First of all, is there anything you'd like to add, anything that you feel that people should know about this particular situation in Japan? I know you mentioned a little bit about the design issue in terms of some of the plans, but is there anything else you'd like us to know?
One of the things is, I think there's been some communication both in Japan and in the press in the U.S. about sort of talking about, well, there are safe levels of exposure, for example, or there are levels below which we don't need to be concerned because there's no perceptible harm. There's no evidence that there's harm. I think that's sort of not forthright with the public, in the sense that there's an extremely large amount of information that we know about how ionizing radiation works, what it does when it interacts with our body, and how it contributes to the causation of cancer. And we know that not everybody has the same level of susceptibility to radiation-induced cancer. So pregnant women, for example, are extremely sensitive to radiation exposure, and it's not 100 units of exposure or 200 units of exposure below which we see no effects. We're talking about relatively small doses on the order of a single diagnostic X-ray delivered to a pregnant woman, causing a real, measurable, easily detectable excess risk of cancer. And that was demonstrated in the 1950s. And this is why, if you go to see a doctor today, the doctor will not wittingly expose a pregnant woman to ionizing radiation. They recognize that hazard, and they'll try and avoid it or minimize it as best they can. So I think we have to have this same sort of recognition that there are people who are very susceptible, particularly the young, and perhaps the very old as well, to the dangers of radiation exposure, and we don't want to minimize or not speak with people in a forthright way about the consequences of what is a very serious disaster that's happening right now in Japan. That's not to say that we need to panic about it, but we have to say that communicate clearly with people and the public in Japan as well about saying that, well, there are some serious hazards posed by what's happening right now as a radiological or environmental disaster. So I think that story has not always gotten out there clearly by the way that the Japanese government and the utility has communicated about the releases that are ongoing right now and have been ongoing for 3.5 weeks now. So it's an important message.
Thank you so much. We thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. That is Dr. David Richardson. You should know that he is the Associate Professor of Epidemiology at the University of North Carolina. You should also know that he was appointed advisor to the President on radiation and worker health. We thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Richardson, and we hope you'll come back and talk with us again about this situation and certainly any other health situations that you feel the public needs to know about in the future.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
You too.